Hello, welcome to From Caracas. I'm Laura Prada, and in this opportunity we'll be talking to John McEvoy, who is journalist for the Canary and who's been living in Colombia for the last 6 months, living what's been going on there, all the challenges facing the region, but also he came to Venezuela and he's been here in the past few days, living and experiencing from first hand what is going on here. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Nice to have you here. Tell me a little bit about your experience here in Venezuela. I hear that you've been working and living with Colectivos.
Indeed, yeah. Well, my experience thus far has been, I was already quite sceptical about the media, the corporate media's representation of what's going on in the country. I, however, expected to see much more suffering than I already have. Nobody's going to deny that there's no suffering in Venezuela at the moment. There obviously is. There's shortages of food, there's shortages of medicine. However, the scale of homelessness in the country and the general suffering that I've seen in day-to-day life has been quite minimal. From the perspective of the Colectivo that I've been in, once again, the corporate media's depiction of Colectivos is quite different to what's actually going on the ground. For example, in the New York Times video that corrected the humanitarian aid trucks story, they still said that Colectivos were armed gangs or something to the same effect. On the ground, actually, Colectivos, it's a collective term. It's a general term for it can be for sports teams, for church groups, for any kind of social organisation on the ground. And that's being missed in the corporate media at the moment. And in my experience, I've been with a youth group called Guardianes del Libertador, Guardians of the Liberator of Simón Bolívar. And what they do is they're basically functioning with about 170 different families at the moment. And they're organising activities for children. Last Sunday, for example, in a collaboration with another Colectivo, the Minca, they organised a kind of street party for children and an arts event, a culture event, a dance event. And so this is the side of Colectivos that we're really not seeing. Grassroots social organisations that are essentially community-based in order to make their communities better.
And why do you think the big media do not show Colectivos from Venezuela in that way? You've seen them.
There's a general demonization of grassroots organisations, not just in Venezuela, but across the world. The ability of people to organise for themselves and for decentralised means of democracy is a theme that's generally demonised. You have it in the UK as well. Momentum is a grassroots organisation that organises people that support the Labour Party. But the media finds a way to demonise these people because it's a way of a transferal of power from vertical structures of power to horizontal structures of power. And that's threatening to elite and to powerful interests. And for that reason, and various others here in Venezuela, for more complex reasons than in the UK, that's why we're getting that representation of Colectivos.
But in Venezuela, not only Colectivos organize in a horizontal way, there are also communities that organize themselves to, in fact, lead and to lead in everyday life with the food shortages and the medicine shortages. Yeah. Why do you think people have organized themselves like that? Why that kind of organization, that kind of techniques to keep going forward? Yeah. It's not taken into consideration by the big media in the world.
No, it's been very interesting since coming, in fact, seeing the ways in which people are organising themselves here, with the problems that they're facing with economic sanctions from the US, but there's also somewhat an economic war inside the country, where if we talk about food, the prices in private markets are roughly 4 times the price of what you would find outside of private markets in communal markets. So people are organising themselves in very interesting ways. I went to a social organisation just this Saturday, where the community is organising so that they buy the food directly from the producer and bring it directly to the community, so that they're essentially bypassing various different economic controls. They're bypassing the private supermarkets that are going to charge extortionate prices, They're also bypassing the wage labour that the supermarkets would have to pay their staff. And there's also various different positives from this as well. So one of the volunteers there was describing that if you go to a communal market where you get the lower prices, you also have a community there, so it has a positive psychological impact as well. He was describing everybody comes here one Saturday a month to get their 20 kilos of food. That's much cheaper than you would get in the private market. Everybody meets together. It's like a party. So there's a psychological impact, and thirdly, there's an environmental impact as well, because you're also reducing the amount, the building that the food is stored in, the transport between the producer, between the market and the consumer, and they're also using various ecological ways to reduce waste. So they're reusing bags, and they're not using as many plastic bags as you would otherwise use. So there's really interesting ways that people are organising to get out of this situation, and by bypassing certain economic issues that would otherwise confront them.
That kind of experiences, that kind of people making ways out of the crisis that the country is going through, but also being forced to go through.
Yeah.
Why do you think, of course, big media corporations don't show it, but why do you think those experiences are silenced and are not seen well in the world today?
Well, there's no doubt that what's going on at the moment in this country is an attempted coup, organised from the outside, primarily from the US, but there are various governments, especially in Europe, that are sponsoring this. And if, for example, if the media were to go and chat to people on the street, everyday people on the street, that they wouldn't get the same response that they wanted. They wouldn't get the response that there is a humanitarian crisis, that people are starving, that there's violence on the streets every day, all day. They wouldn't get the responses that the powerful interests that are supporting this coup are looking for. Yeah.
Though Colombia trained paramilitary forces, and they also have the School of Americas to train with paramilitary forces.
Yeah.
Even all that kind of aggression is taking place not openly, but also secretly. Even though Venezuela has always kept a position of a brother giving their hand to help to settle the peace in the region, in Colombia.
Well, it's a shame, really. I mean, that Venezuela has tried to be a force for peace in Colombia. That after that, Colombia would essentially function as a base for the US to operate in order to try and orchestrate a coup in this country. There are also various contradictions, I suppose, between what's going on in Colombia and what's going on in Venezuela at the moment, because we hear so much about humanitarian crisis in this country, whereas in Colombia also has some very serious problems. I mean, since 2016, when the peace agreement was culminated, more social leaders have been killed in Colombia than the years prior. So there's actually been an increase in intensification in certain patterns of violence. And these patterns of violence go back decades to the US counterinsurgency training. So we also have that, and another issue with Colombia functioning as an ally for the US to intervene in Venezuela is that it should be very, very worrying for countries in Latin America to hear the likes of John Bolton saying that we shouldn't be afraid to invoke the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially gives the US the supposed legitimacy to operate in their own backyard, which is Latin America. So when you have US officials saying in such plain words their imperialist intentions in this region, then that should be very worrying for people in Colombia to see themselves functioning as an imperialist outlet into Venezuela.
After February 23rd, actions in the frontier between Colombia and Venezuela, we've seen the news, we've heard information, updates of data updates have been merged. from that situation, calling that, I don't know, in Cauca, in Cucuta, people are starving, people depend on that commerce between that take place at the frontier in Cucuta, for example, and the situation that have been developing there in Cauca specifically, the assassination of social leaders. Why do you think for United States as a imperialist force, besides having this place in the region where they can allied place in the region, they can use as a bridge to access to Venezuela, they are creating that situation on the other hand, that instability?
So it's, I mean, it appears a contradiction that the US would be promoting violence in one place and supposedly be against it in another place. However, this pattern of violence goes back, as I said, decades. And the difference between patterns of violence in Colombia and in Venezuela at the moment is the patterns of violence in Colombia, they complement private capital interests. So the wide-scale killing of social leaders in Colombia complements an economic structure that goes into the hands of private interests, often private multinationals. And you've had various cases of private multinationals in Colombia being tied to the very paramilitary forces that we're talking about. In Venezuela, however, you've since for two or so decades, we've had a different economic structure. In various ways, this economic structure has gone towards the nationalization of public goods, so oil, education, for instance, health as well. We have a completely different, well, a very different economic structure, and the message that sends from taking your own national wealth and redistributing it among your own domestic population is not invited by the US. So not only does that threaten US capital in Venezuela, not only does it threaten, for example, would it threaten US oil interests, it also offers a symbolic threat of a good example that other nations in Latin America might take an example from. They might say, oh well, during Chavez, for example, poverty was reduced from 51 to 27%, for example. There were different literacy initiatives, educational initiatives, etc. And other countries might look at that and say, that's a positive symbol. Maybe we will also nationalise and redistribute wealth within our own country. And that symbolic threat is more important than the direct capital threat of the country. So you have these two different economic structures, and one of them is threatening to the US model, global economic model, and the other one complements it.
But not only a social threat, also a political threat. Why do you think for countries like United States or other European countries who in a moment, like United States it still does, like in Puerto Rico, they see the rest of the world as their colony, as their territory, where they can say what they must do, what they must work for, what they must read, where they should go, which political system they should follow. Why is it a threat that countries like Venezuela, like Bolivia, follow, like of course Cuba, follow a socialist path that defends that the people have access to all the resources the country produces, that owns? Why do you think countries like United States, is historical colonialist powers, see that as a threat?
Because if one country is allowed to go down this particular route, it will set an example that other countries can perhaps go down this particular route as well. So as soon as one country tries to go down this route, the US essentially puts a stop to it. It's the rotten apple theory. If one rotten apple in the barrel goes bad, the rest of it will rot. And so what the US perceives as rotten is the redistribution of wealth and social justice and economic justice in various countries across the world. I mean, it's not just in Latin America. I mean, you saw it throughout the Vietnam War, for example, as well. so you have that, but if we take the example of Nicaragua, for example, and I think there are striking similarities between Nicaragua and Venezuela at the moment, because from 1979, when the Sandinistas were elected, you basically had the US was trying to grind the society down to its absolute knees, and it's within the secret document that throughout the 11 years of the Sandinistas before the Nicaraguan population decided to vote against them in 1990. Throughout these years, the US was essentially waging a terrorist war in order that all of the government's resources were redirected to this war, so they couldn't actually implement the social policies that they wanted to. And I think we can see similarities between the kind of war of attrition that occurred in Nicaragua. Just to add that Elliot Abrams was also involved in this conflict as well. So it's not just an ideological or a technical similarity. There's actually the same personnel are being churned out once again in this conflict.
Heading the attack.
Yeah. So it's worrying at the moment to see a similar process happening in Venezuela, that the US is essentially trying to grind this country down to its knees, and that's essentially what I worry about, because I see all of these social organisations, these Colectivos, that are working together to try and find a way out of this problem that's occurring at the moment. But if the US continues to choke the economy, it's unsure at this point for how long they can continue.
I have one question. I have two more questions for you. One of them, why do you think that Colectivos and social movements and groups, communities here in Venezuela are organizing themselves and to find a way out of the situation, but at the same time they support the constituent president of the country? Why do you think that happens? Though, as you were saying, U.S. is trying to choke Venezuela to the point that they leave everything.
Well, it's to answer the first question. It's interesting to be in Venezuela and see how politically conscious and how politically informed people here are. I mean, you can have a really complex conversation about politics with a 12-year-old in Venezuela, which is almost unthinkable, not just in the US but in the UK as well. And what I've found is Venezuelans have a much greater knowledge of US foreign policy than people in the US in general. And with that knowledge, even though they're suffering at the moment, they're very much aware the intentions behind what's going on at the moment. So this solidarity is basically to fight something that's coming from the outside to battle against an external pressure that they are very much aware is not a benevolent external pressure. So as long as this goes on, they're very much aware that, at least it seems to me, that the choice is simple: to solidarity or to crumble in the face of an imperialist power.
The other question I wanted to ask you is, do you think that progressive movements, left movements in Latin America, are called to end? Are they suffocating also from these pressures the United States is putting on them?
Well, at least in my analysis...
Or it will give them the strength to become stronger and to keep giving the fight?
I mean, obviously international solidarity with what's going on here is important, but it's also difficult to really gauge the strength of economic pressure from the US at the moment. I mean, it's quite incredible, the economic pressure that they have.
But Cuba have resisted that economic pressure for 50 years. Could Venezuela do the same? Or the left movements do the same here in Latin America?
Well, a lot of people have spoken about Cuba and how Cuba has much less resources than Venezuela, has much less general natural wealth than Venezuela, and they're convinced that they're able to do it. Me personally, I couldn't hazard a guess on a counterfactual like that, unfortunately.
But I insist. Okay. Do you think left movements in Latin America and the Caribbean, these progressive movements that with Bolivia, with Venezuela, with Nicaragua, with Cuba. The way they opened the eyes and the possibility they gave to the Latin American people of health, education, do you think that progressive movements are going to reinvent themselves? Are they going to go forward? Or do you think they're going to just suffocate because of the pressure United States is putting on?
Well, what I've seen in Venezuela thus far has been a real reinvention of economic norms of organising, and if that were possible on a national scale, which it is, but if that were done on a national scale, yeah, I think the social organisations in Venezuela could ride out this storm together, and it's also important to hope that they can and to function as if they could, as well, because if you function from a platform of believing that something is possible, it's more likely to be able to be done as well. So it's important to imagine that it is possible.
Do you think that it's possible for Latin America to remain as a peace zone, as they as Latin American leaders called that this is?
I wouldn't necessarily call Latin America a zone of peace in general. I mean, since the Second World War, it's often been a zone of incredible violence. But what I see in Venezuela is an understanding behind why that violence happened. And yeah, that's the first step towards actually achieving peace, understanding why it happened.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Jan.
you very much. Cheers for having me.
Thank you for talking with us. Like this, we come to the end of this From Caracas, and this opportunity we spoke with John McEvoy, who is journalist for the Canary, and he's been sharing with us his experiences here in Venezuela and in Colombia, and what he thinks of Latin American process here in these past few months. So thank you again, John.